muskie, I believe, from Chris Guy, who is a cooperative fisheries wildlife unit. People like big fish. So the topics in this are biogeographical determinants of fish assemblage diversity, how physiology alters growth, survival, some of the population stuff, talking about regulation, exploitation of fish stocks, stocking fish, and aquaculture. So we can come back to some of the stuff that we talked about with island biogeography and diversity in general and see that those patterns also tend to hold. And some of our examples were fish examples. Large continents have more fish on them than small islands do, more species of fish than small islands. Old lakes and watersheds tend to have more diverse fish species than new watersheds. So we talk about, for example, the idea of glaciation basically making systems that are, now 10,000 years old or so since the continental ice sheets retreated. Those systems have only had 10,000 years for species to either come in or to evolve in them. In contrast, something like the Mississippi River watershed has been there continuously over numerous glaciations, and the Amazon River has flowed continuously over numerous glaciations, and basically until there's major continental drift, those will remain fairly stable habitats. And then we talked about Lake Baikal and Tanganyika and some of those old African Rift Valley lakes, where time for evolution drives biodiversity. Fishes are more diverse in the tropics and the temperate systems, and that's a fairly general pattern that occurs with plants and terrestrial animals as well, and terrestrial insects, although for some reason aquatic insects don't seem to follow that pattern so much. And I don't know what the exact reason for that is, but I think that with the fish, its time of evolution is important, and they're able to move around and stay in habitats as well. If you have more within habitat diversity, the diversity can be greater. So this goes back to this idea of restoration of fish habitat, right? What you're actually doing is you're creating more environmental heterogeneity, so there's more sub-habitats for different fishes to live in. If you might, particular one species you might want, you can slant it towards that. But obviously, since different species of fish specialize on different prey, on different habitats, you want to have a mixture of different habitats if you want to have the highest diversity of fishes in the system. And there tend to be more diverse in large rivers than small. That if you go from upstream to downstream, you tend to have an increasing diversity. And that's true if you go from Kings Creek to McDowell Creek to Kansas River, and it's true if you go from most river systems. Part of that might be related to this time thing, that these very small streams are relatively short-lived relative to the large ones. And part of it's related to disturbance, because you can think of floods and drought having a much more abrupt and extreme effect on a small watershed than it does on a river. The reason being, the Mississippi River is integrating a huge area, and so the response, even if there's a big flood on the Mississippi River, it's never fast, right? It takes weeks to come up and weeks to go back down. So the fish can respond to that. And in contrast, a flood on Kanza, where there's a 20-foot wall of water that comes down in 2 minutes, and basically large amounts of debris moving around, or some of these debris flow and mud flows that happen in mountainous areas under extreme, say, a rain on snow event, can basically wipe out all the fish in the entire stretch of stream, or even maybe in a sub-watershed. So they're always getting hammered by this as well, not having a long time to sit in that one area and evolve. This is some work that David Eggs did in Nepal, and he's a fish biologist at Emporia State University. But he was fortunate enough to go from upstream in the Himalayas all the way down into the large rivers around collecting fish, and I think he's actually next year he's going to go back and redo this work again and look at and see how it is. We see that as you go downstream, you can have more and more species. This is also a common ecological pattern, in that if you draw a line, try to draw a line through this, and remember you had your regression analysis that you did. It's not going to be a great line because there's a lot of scatter around this line. But what you can think of is there being an envelope where the upper edge of it is what sort of gives you your maximum diversity at any level. But conditions might not be such that you get very much diversity in any particular sampling site. Right? So it's not a straight linear view of the world. It's this idea of a wedge-shaped envelope being constraining what can happen in the system. And we've already seen this type of pattern, like when we talked about the rate of photosynthesis as a function of temperature, where we saw all kinds of different photosynthetic rates, right, as temperature increased, but at low temperature, photosynthesis had to be low, so there's this upper level that went. It's a very common pattern. You know, in this case, you might have something that had a lot of sediment or something that poured in from the field nearby, so it's just not suitable habitat where they happen to sample. Whereas this is a nice, fairly pristine stretch of river that they have here. So something else can influence them, but that this sets the upper level. Here's the example of the two examples of fishes in temperate versus tropical streams that in Bill Matthews' book on fish ecology. Do you guys use that book actually as a textbook, or is it just? It's quite a good book if you're interested in fish ecology. It's got some really general stuff in it. And so if we look at the number of fish species found in each sample, and we have here a tropical stream and a temperate stream. There's no A and B in there. Oh, that might be in the book, but I found it, so I guess you can't get a test point for that. Is that in the book? Too bad. I had a student send me a couple more errors too that you guys missed, so they're in there. They're lurking in there still. I think next time I offer a class, I'll have to offer 2 test points per error just because they're getting harder to find now. So if we look at this, this is basically a percentage of the total sample. And we see that, you know, there's a lot of samples, 204 samples in the tropical stream and 815 samples here. So, you know, 2% of the samples would be, you know, 4 samples. So basically, 4 samples in the tropical areas had 100 species of fish in them, right? You'll never get that here. I don't care how you sample the Kansas River, you're not going to get 100 species of fish. Or even if you go to the most speciose areas of North America for fishes, down in the southeastern United States, you're still not going to come up with that many species. Perhaps the best you'll do is 70 species per sample. But the bulk of the samples, you're getting somewhere around 10 or 20 species if you're doing a tropical sample. In contrast, there's not really even sort of a peak here, but it seems, you know, you can get anywhere. It sort of falls off up at the end, but it seems like 20 to 40 species is pretty common when you get into a system. And this is sort of the same idea that there's some of these where you get one or no species, right? So sometimes you take a sample and there's just nothing there, right? Sometimes you go fishing and you get skunked. Sometimes, you know, but there's a whole bunch of these up here where you're getting literally 80, 90, 100 species in a sample. So real data to show you the tropical thing works. Another thing that happens is apparently that you have a situation where species won't evolve if there's not essentially can't partition their food out. And predators essentially at best can specialize on one species. You don't have many fish species. It's not like parasites, right, where you can have multiple parasites and they specialize on your gut or your throat or something in different parts of your body. So there's very few cases where when you sample, you see more predatory species than prey species occurring in the system. So there's another thing that determines the diversity is the length of the food web, and this is sort of where that productivity thing and number of species. So another way of looking at it is that species diversity evolves based on the species diversity that's already there. Why are there so many insects in the tropics? Well, part of it is because there's a whole lot of plant species for them to specialize in. Why are there so many predatory fish species in large rivers in the tropics? Well, it's because there's a lot of prey, different types of prey species for them to specialize on. So another thing that people have done when they've talked about fish and their ecology is how they go about making a living. And there's a whole field of study where people look at model the bioenergetics of different fish species. And then this becomes the core for either conserving those species or managing those species and pushing them in, understanding the physiology. And I'll talk about energetics. Osmoregulation can also be important, and it's pretty amazing how salmonid eels and such, they go essentially from systems with very different salinities and completely change their physiology to make it so they can maintain their salt balance. They have to maintain an exact salt balance. And then all these things as well, temperature, oxygen, food quality, predator avoidance are all important. We can talk about some of those. So we'll talk about some kind of environmental gradient. Now this might be pH, temperature, food availability even. Not so likely with food availability, I guess. But. So you think about temperature, and you have essentially the energy equivalent that it takes you to survive is on the y-axis. And on the x-axis there's some increasing factor. We could say that's increasing temperature. And if it's super cold, essentially all your energy goes into just in making it, especially if you're gonna freeze, right? Then at some point you just can't have enough energy to keep yourself warm and you die as a fish. If it gets too hot, all your energy is going into essentially repairing your proteins and keeping them from denaturing, and you're gonna die. So once it takes more than 100% of your energy to respond to any environmental factor, you're dead because you can't continue to do that. The first thing you got to do is survive as an organism. And then we can think of, well, surviving's fine, but to be successful, you need to grow, right? You need to be able to grow. You need to be able to get from being a juvenile to a reproductive adult. And there's a narrower range of environmental conditions under which growth is possible. And so you can think of this happening over a season. We already talked about seasonal succession in lakes, right, where the fish species tend to have their larvae at times when the food availability is high and the temperature is high, right? So they have this narrower range where the larvae can successfully grow and be adults. And a lot of times in the winter time, when they're down here at these low temperatures and low food availabilities, they're just waiting and just using all this energy to survive. And then, once you can have enough energy to grow, then the next thing is in even another narrower window, this condition that you're in good enough condition to actually reproduce. So you can think of it, and so you can imagine then when you make one of these physiological models, if you can characterize all these curves against an environmental gradient, and then you can have multiple environmental gradients if you want. Each one of these can have its own equation, and you can model, if you change the environment from here to here, how much reproduction growth you'd expect out of the fisheries. Well, when we manage fish, we basically need to understand population biology. And as I stated, fisheries ecologists or biologists are perhaps some of the earliest population biologists around. And the reason is there's a substantial amount of economic activity that goes on with that. And one of the things that came up, Rickard figured out this idea of maximal sustainable yield. That is that there's some amount of fish you can take from a fishery and still get the maximum production out of it. And there's a lot of assumptions that go into that, and it's been criticized by a number of people. But if you know the number of adults and the young and some of the mortalities, it's actually useful in some situations. The problem is actually knowing the number of adults and young, and salmon are one of the species that you can do that with, and that's what Ricker was working with. For what it's worth, I talked to Ricker, and I think this is in the book, I talked to Ricker before he passed away to interview him for this book, and I asked him what the most important research things for the future were, and his answer was people should go out and try to save the environment, because if they don't do that, they're not going to have anything to study. So he was a very practical scientist as a young person, approached it more as an engineer, but became an environmentalist by the end of his life, a fairly strong environmentalist. So that's just an interesting aside. So you can regulate different sizes, closed seasons, gear, number of fish removed. In general, oftentimes regulations are really not that effective, and that the reason limits are set are more to make the anglers happy that they have some goal to reach, basically. But sometimes they can be useful. And in particular, things like these limits, these slot limits, where you actually say, okay, you can take out a bunch of the smaller fish that are all competing with each other, but you have to release the large fish, so then you keep your large reproductive fish in the system, but you allow the fish that are smaller than the slot limit to be able to grow up to it without as much competition, because there's not as high numbers. Some of the ones that really do work are closed seasons gear, because a lot of the times seasons are set, so if people know the reproductive biology of many fish species, and they can take advantage of them being all concentrated in one small spot. So they become particularly vulnerable to predation at that point. Okay. So oftentimes spawning season will be a closed season for fishes. And for the species where there isn't a closed season, oftentimes the peak time to catch them is during spawning season or close there, because they're concentrated, they have a high energy demand, so they're feeding as fast as they can to get back to that energetics graph that we put up there. And gear is very clear. I mean, if you want to really catch fish, you just go out with some dynamite and throw it in there, and they all float to the top, right? Or you can always use nets more effectively than you can line. Well, not always, but usually use nets more effectively. If those are clearly illegal to use for recreational fisheries, or we just wipe them out. I think that one of the other things to talk about here is that in spite of regulation, almost every major fishery in the world has been overexploited. And there's very few, some that are maybe heavily regulated now have been able to come back, but the general trend of things is to basically bring a fish species down until it's almost extinct or extirpated. And it's nowhere is this more true than in the open ocean, where it's very difficult to regulate fishing in the international waters. And we see the largest of the fish mostly gone from the open ocean. They've been mostly taken out. And the size of the species that get larger has become smaller. And we basically have a movement towards more fishing lower on the food web, if you will. And that's also true for many freshwater systems as well. So there's actually a particularly large challenge for people that are going into fisheries management, because it's not always rational what people want to do with an environment. They want what they can get out of it, not what's best for the species that's involved. Well, one of the ways to deal with that is to stock fish in, and this basically makes it so a fishery, if it's not productive enough to support the level of angling that you'd like in it, or if a species is going extinct, you would stock it into the habitat. And it's used by quite a few different areas. The state of Kansas now is trying to put Topeka shiners into some areas where it's been extirpated because it's a federally endangered species. they're real easy to grow in culture, and and so they'll put them out, and they try to maximize the similarity of the genetics of or use species with genetics as close as geographically as close as possible to where they're releasing them. Right. So they don't want to mess up the genetic structure by basically selecting for a weedy species, that weedy strain that does well in basically fish ponds, right? But maybe wouldn't compete so well out in the natural environment. And there's always selection going on, right? There's always selection going on, and so if you just use that as your primary criteria, you could perhaps the best, easiest species to grow, you could swamp the system with genetics that aren't favorable to the long-term maintenance of that species. Oftentimes we introduce new species. This is very common. There's most of the farm ponds in Kansas that are of any size have had bass and catfish and perch and bluegill added to them, because that's part of what people want out of creating a pond like that. And oftentimes the large reservoirs have species added to them. So what are some of those species that they add around here? Wiper, right, which is what?
Striped bass, white bass hybrid.
Yeah. Are there any other ones?
Sagai.
I think Sagai is the other major one they put in around here that's not. And that one's also a hybrid, I believe. Is that correct? And so this, you know, I mean, you could argue in a reservoir that wasn't there anyway, you might as well use it, right, and do what you want with it. The problem with this is when we get into these things where you don't control the amount of diseases that come in, you have out-competition of native fishes, hybridization with native fishes, or lack of genetic diversity in populations. So some of these examples of introducing diseases, probably the most widespread in North America is the whirling disease that came in brown trout from Europe, and it's a protozoan that infects the neural system of salmonids and basically causes them to be unable to swim straight, so they whirl around. Obviously not a good thing for them to get. It'll kill the fish. And this escaped from hatcheries that were supplementing and adding fishes to natural systems into wild populations, and now it's ingrained essentially in many of the wild populations. So that's been a difficult thing. Out-competing native fishes, usually what you'll try to do, and the idea is that there could be what are called empty niches out there in ecological sense, right? That there could be a habitat that a species is not evolved to take advantage of in one area, but it has in another. So if you add it in there, there's no effect on the other species. And if you remember back to when we talked about introduced species, that is one of the ideas, that most introductions don't really have a very big effect on the species, the other species in the system. However, one of the other general principles of that was that large predators do tend to have large effects, more likely to have large effects, right? And when we put fish species in areas, we generally put large predatory fish. And you can get some real messy situations with trying to tinker with fisheries. And one of the examples of this is Flathead Lake. And in Flathead Lake, there was a number of different additions that went on that really changed the lake system. One is lake trout were put into the system. Another is kokanee salmon. That's a landlocked salmon that's put into the system. And the third has to do with the mysid shrimp, Mysis relicta. And all these species were perhaps at one time in this area, but after the glaciation, it moved them out of upper North America, upper Midwest. I think mostly to the west of the Rockies, but I'm not absolutely sure. And so what they decided to do with these mysids was that they thought that it was a good food source for the kokanee salmon. And the reason they did this, they thought this was one of the lakes that they put them into had an outlet that had water flowing up from deep down and then going over a shallow sill before it went out of the system. And mice and shrimp go down during the daytime to escape predation. They just go right down to the sediments. And with this current, though, it was pushing the mysids up into the epilimnion, essentially, and giving access of the salmon, of the kokanee and the trout that were in that particular lake to this prey base. And so it really stimulated growth of these fish. So then they got the bright idea, well, we should go around and add this everywhere. But most systems don't have this strong upwelling current to drive them up from the bottom. And so you get them basically competing very well for zooplankton, right? They're predatory, relatively large crustaceans and predators, and so they're able to eat the zooplankton from the system and short wire the food web so that it's not going into the regular small fish species that would be eating those zooplankton. So that was one of the shifts that's worked its way into. It was put in actually in a lake upstream, and it works its way down through the whole system, because once you get something into a watershed, it's going to spread through the whole thing, right? It's almost impossible to stop that. So there's a number of unanticipated changes and negative things, depending upon your point of view, that happen from these various introductions. One is the kokanee salmon were directly competitors with the native trout, which is they call bull trout, but it's a cutthroat related to one of the cutthroat species. And that's an endangered species, so there's a problem there, and it was driving that one out to extinction in that particular lake. The second one is that the lake trout were also taking out the native whitefish because they tended to wait till they got bigger, and then they take them out. And then the third thing that had developed was, well, a couple things that developed related to these non-native fishes. One is that there was a large recreational lake trout fishery in the lake, and there were guides and that kind of stuff. So there's actually some generation of economic activity from that lake trout that went in there. And the kokanee salmon all would go up to the Glacier National Park to spawn in the rivers up there and bring in massive numbers of eagles to eat the adults that were spent after they'd spawned. Well, they could get them beforehand, they'd eat them too, but there was lots of eagles there, so it was a really popular tourist thing to go see the eagles that were eating all these salmon. Okay, so now the mysis shrimp comes in, and the mysis shrimp turns out to be competing with these kokanee salmon because they're using, for at least part of their life cycle, they're using zooplankton as their food source. And the mysis just out-competed them. It comes up at night, and the kokanees are site feeders, so they're not going to be able to get them at night, and goes down during the day, and they're nowhere to be found. But then what happened was that this actually stimulated the small lake trout, because the small lake trout were actually able to go down and get some of those mysid shrimps. And so the lake trout went from getting very large successfully to having a lot of small lake trout, and they switched over from a trophy fishery to an actually edible fish, because large lake trout are pretty oily, strong flavored salmonids. But it took that economic activity out of there. And crashing the kokanee population, it also crashed the eagle watching, because the eagles stopped coming when there weren't fish there. So it's an interesting situation. So some of the negative effects that cascaded onto the other species, lower economic activity, whereas actually changing non-native species abundances, things that wouldn't have been there anyway. A very complex and ugly management situation. In general, probably the general philosophy should be of adding species is that you shouldn't, unless you can really prove that it's not going to cause harm, right? that there's just so many cases of added species that were either intentionally or unintentionally added that caused trouble. So I guess the question of today would be, what species do you know of that were added intentionally or unintentionally? And this is just fish species that you've heard about that caused trouble, in addition to some of the stuff that I've mentioned.